The stone floor was cold against Lyra's knees, the rough brush scraping her already raw hands as she worked the soap into another stubborn stain. Blood, probably. The castle's servants' quarters always seemed to harbour the darkest secrets in the darkest corners, and she had become intimately familiar with every shadow, every crack, every whispered cruelty that echoed through these halls. 3 years. 3 years since she'd been cast out from her pack, with nothing but the clothes on her back, and accusations that still burned like acid in her throat. 3 years of scrubbing floors that would never truly be clean, of wearing borrowed dresses that hung loose on her too thin frame, of making herself invisible because invisible meant safe. The borrowed grey wool dress she wore tonight was patched at the elbows and hung nearly to her ankles, salvaged from the castle's charity box after her last dress had been ruined in a kitchen accident that wasn't quite an accident. Head maid Beatrice had made sure of that, just as she made sure Lyra received the worst assignments, the longest hours, the smallest portions of food. "She doesn't belong here," Beatrice had whispered to the other servants just this morning, her voice carrying the particular venom reserved for those she considered beneath even her notice. "Packless strays always bring trouble, mark my words." Lyra had kept scrubbing, had kept her eyes down, had swallowed the familiar taste of shame that came with being nobody. Because that's what she was now, wasn't she? Nobody. Nothing. A girl whose own mate had looked her in the eyes 3 years ago and declared her worthless before their entire pack. The memory still made her hands shake. She pushed harder against the stain, watching the dirty water swirl away into the bucket. The throne room was supposed to be empty at this hour, all the important people tucked away in their warm beds while she cleaned up the evidence of their important lives. She preferred it this way, working alone in the darkness where no one could see her, where she could almost pretend she belonged somewhere. The great windows let in slivers of moonlight that painted silver patterns across the marble floors, across the massive throne that dominated the far end of the room. She'd never dared look at it directly during the day, when the Alpha King held court and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. She was furniture then, invisible and unimportant, just another servant girl who might as well have been part of the stone walls. But alone like this, in the quiet hours before dawn, she could appreciate the craftsmanship of the carved wolves that adorned the throne's arms, the way the ancient symbols seemed to shift and dance in the flickering candlelight. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache with longing for things she'd never have. The sound of boots on marble made her freeze. Heavy footsteps, purposeful and measured, echoing through the vast space. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs as she scrambled to make herself smaller, to disappear into the shadows beside the massive pillar where she'd been working. Please let them pass. Please let them not notice her. Please let them... "The floors look clean enough." The voice was deep, rough with exhaustion, and entirely too close. Lyra's breath caught in her throat as she realized the footsteps had stopped just a few feet from where she crouched. She could see expensive black boots, mud-stained from travel, and the hem of a dark cloak that had seen better days. Alpha King Marcus. She knew without looking up, knew from the way the air in the room seemed to shift and thicken, the way her wolf stirred restlessly beneath her skin despite her broken bond. He was supposed to be away on a diplomatic mission to the Southern Territories. He wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be caught. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty." The words tumbled out in a whisper as she pressed herself flatter against the cold stone. "I was just finishing. I'll go. I didn't mean to. Look at me." The command was gentle but unmistakable, carrying the weight of authority that made her wolf whimper in submission. Lyra's hands clenched against her skirt, every instinct screaming at her to run, to hide, to do anything but obey. She was nobody. She wasn't supposed to look at kings, but something in his tone, something warm and patient beneath the exhaustion, made her slowly raise her head. The first thing she noticed were his eyes, grey like storm clouds, shadowed with weariness but impossibly kind as they met hers across the space between them. The second thing she noticed was the way those eyes widened slightly, the way his entire body went very still, as if something had shifted in the world, and he was the first to feel it. Heat bloomed in her chest, sudden and inexplicable, spreading through her limbs like honey mixed with lightning. A golden thread seemed to pull taut between them, invisible but undeniable, making her gasp softly in surprise. Her wolf, silent and broken for 3 long years, lifted its head and whined. No, no, this wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. Not to her, not with him. "What's your name?" he asked quietly, and she realised he had moved closer without her noticing, was crouching down so they were nearly at eye level. His face was all sharp angles and masculine beauty, dark hair dishevelled from his journey, but there was something almost reverent in the way he was looking at her, like she mattered. "Lyra!" she whispered, because lying to an Alpha King seemed like a particularly stupid way to die. "Lyra Thorne." Lyra. He said her name like he was testing the weight of it, like it meant something important. "How long have you worked here?" 3 years, Your Majesty." She started to push herself up from the floor, to properly curtsy or bow or whatever she was supposed to do when royalty found you scrubbing their floors in the middle of the night. But his hand came up in a small gesture that somehow stopped her mid-motion. "Don't!" His voice was soft, almost pleading. "Don't do that. Don't make yourself smaller." But small was safe. Small was invisible. Small was the only way she'd survived this long. "I should go," she said instead, finally managing to get to her feet, but keeping her eyes down, focused on the bucket of dirty water at her feet. "I'm not supposed to be here when what? When someone might actually see you?" The question made her look up sharply, startled by something that sounded almost like anger in his voice. But his expression was gentle, those grey eyes fixed on her face like he was trying to memorize every detail. "You're hurt," he said suddenly, and she realized he was looking at the bruise that darkened her left cheekbone, the one she'd tried to cover with the fall of her hair. It was from yesterday, when Beatrice had decided Lyra was moving too slowly and had helped her along with the back of her hand. "I'm clumsy," Lyra said automatically, the lie as familiar as breathing. "I fell down the stairs." Something dangerous flickered in his eyes, but his voice remained gentle. "I see." They stood there in the moonlit silence, and Lyra felt like the world had tilted sideways. This was the Alpha King, the most powerful shifter in the realm, feared and respected by enemies and allies alike. He could have anyone he wanted, could command the loyalty of thousands, could reshape the world with a word. And he was looking at her like she was something precious. "You should rest," she said finally, desperately, because this moment felt too fragile and too impossible to sustain. "You must be tired from your journey." "I am," he agreed, but he made no move to leave. "But I'm not sure I'll be able to sleep." "Your Majesty." "Call me Marcus," he said softly, "at least here in the quiet. Just Marcus." The intimacy of it made her chest tight with panic, and something else, something warm and dangerous that she couldn't afford to feel. "I couldn't, I'm just—" "You're just what?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Just a servant, just nobody, just the packless girl who'd been thrown away like garbage and somehow ended up here, surviving on scraps and staying invisible. "I'm nobody," she whispered, the truth cutting like glass in her throat. "I'm no one important." He took a step closer, and she caught his scent then, pine and rainfall, and something wild that made her broken wolf keen with longing. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the force of absolute conviction. "You're not nobody, not to me." The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her heart stutter in her chest. She wanted to argue, to explain all the reasons why he was wrong, why she was exactly nobody and would always be nobody. But the way he was looking at her, the golden warmth still spreading through her limbs, the impossible gentleness in his storm-grey eyes. "I don't understand," she breathed. "Neither do I," he admitted, and something in his voice suggested he was just as shaken as she was. "But I'd like to." The silence stretched between them, full of possibilities and terrors in equal measure. Lyra's hands trembled as she gripped the handle of the bucket, the physical weight of it somehow anchoring her to reality, even as everything else spun out of control. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Men like Marcus didn't notice girls like her, didn't speak to them in gentle voices and look at them like they hung the moon. She was broken, discarded, worthless. She was... "May I ask you something?" His voice was careful, respectful in a way that made her throat close with emotion. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Will you let me see you again?" The question was so unexpected, so impossible, that she could only stare at him. See her again. Like this was a beginning rather than an ending, like she was someone worth seeking out. She started to speak, stopped, tried again. "I don't think that would be appropriate, Your Majesty." "Marcus," he corrected gently, "and let me worry about what's appropriate." There was something in his tone, a quiet authority mixed with surprising vulnerability, that made her believe he meant it, that maybe, impossibly, he saw something in her worth protecting. "Okay," she whispered, the word barely audible even in the cathedral silence of the throne room. His smile was soft and devastatingly beautiful, transforming his tired face into something that made her heart skip like a stone across water. "Good. That's good." He stepped back then, giving her space to breathe, but his eyes never left her face. "Sleep well, Lyra Thorne." "Sleep well, Marcus," she replied softly, his name feeling strange and precious on her tongue. He turned to go, his footsteps echoing across the marble as he headed toward the great doors that led to the royal wing. But just before he disappeared into the shadows, he paused and looked back. "Lyra?" "Yes?" "You belong here more than you know." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the moonlight with the taste of possibility sharp and sweet on her lips, and the impossible conviction that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't nobody after all. The sun was barely a promise on the horizon when Lyra crept from her narrow servant's bed, her body aching from too little sleep and too many dreams filled with storm-grey eyes. She told herself it had been nothing, a moment of madness brought on by exhaustion and moonlight. Alpha King Marcus had been tired from his journey, perhaps a bit delirious, and she had been exactly where she wasn't supposed to be. By morning, he would have forgotten all about the nobody scrubbing his floors. That's what she told herself as she pulled on the same patched grey dress, as she braided her long brown hair into its usual severe plait, as she made her way to the servants' hall for morning assignments. Normal. Everything would go back to normal, and she could return to the safety of being invisible. Headmaid Beatrice was waiting for her. "Well, well," Beatrice's voice dripped with false sweetness as her pale eyes raked over Lyra with undisguised contempt. "Our little floor scrubber is finally gracing us with her presence." Lyra kept her eyes down, hands clasped behind her back in the submissive posture she'd perfected over 3 years of survival. "Good morning, Headmaid Beatrice. I apologise for my lateness." "Lateness?" Beatrice laughed, a sharp sound that made the other servants look up from their morning bread with uncomfortable expressions. "Oh, my dear girl, punctuality is the least of your concerns this morning." Something cold settled in Lyra's stomach. "I don't understand." "You were seen last night," Beatrice said, circling Lyra like a predator sizing up wounded prey. "In the throne room, after hours, when you should have been in your quarters like a proper servant." The other servants had gone very quiet now, sensing drama, sensing blood in the water. Lyra's hands began to shake behind her back, but she kept her voice steady. "I was finishing my cleaning duties, Headmaid, nothing more." "Nothing more?" Beatrice's voice rose to a shriek that made several servants flinch. "You were bothering His Majesty. The Alpha King himself had to deal with your presumptuous behaviour when he should have been resting after his long journey." Heat flamed in Lyra's cheeks, but not from shame. From anger, swift and unexpected. "I didn't bother anyone. I was doing my job." "Your job," Beatrice snarled, "is to be invisible. Your job is to clean and scrub and keep your mouth shut and never, ever put yourself where you might be noticed by your betters. Clearly you've forgotten your place." She gestured sharply to two of the burlier male servants, who stepped forward with expressions that promised pain. "Today you'll be cleaning the castle's sewers, all of them, by yourself. Perhaps crawling through filth will remind you what you really are." The servants' hall had gone dead silent, except for the sound of Lyra's heart pounding in her ears. Sewer duty was punishment reserved for the worst infractions, work so degrading and dangerous that even the lowest servants feared it. People had died down there, overcome by fumes or lost in the labyrinthine passages beneath the castle. Headmaid Beatrice. The voice that cut through the tension was deep, authoritative and impossible. Every head in the servants' hall turned toward the doorway, where Alpha King Marcus stood in all his commanding presence. He was dressed formally this morning in black leather and silver, his dark hair swept back, his storm-grey eyes taking in the scene with sharp intelligence. But Lyra felt the weight of his gaze settle on her face like a physical touch, and her breath caught in her throat. What was he doing here? "Your Majesty," Beatrice dropped into a deep curtsy, her voice suddenly honey-sweet. "What an unexpected honour. How may we serve you this morning?" Marcus stepped into the room, and Lyra noticed the way the other servants shrank back instinctively, recognising the leashed power in his movements. But when he spoke, his voice was conversational, almost pleasant. "I came to personally request that Miss Thorne be reassigned to the castle library. I have need of someone with particular skills to help organise some ancient texts." The silence that followed was so complete that Lyra could hear her own heartbeat. She stared at the floor, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to do anything that might shatter this impossible moment. "The library, Your Majesty?" Beatrice's voice had gone very small. "But surely someone more qualified would be better suited to such important work." "I think Miss Thorne will do perfectly." Marcus's tone brooked no argument, carrying all the weight of absolute authority. "In fact, I insist upon it." "Of course, Your Majesty, whatever you command." Beatrice's curtsy was so deep it was practically grovelling, though I should mention that Miss Thorne was just about to begin an important cleaning assignment. Was she? Marcus's voice had gone dangerously quiet, and Lyra risked a glance upward to see his grey eyes fixed on Beatrice with an expression that made the older woman visibly pale. "How fortunate that I arrived when I did then, Miss Thorne?" Lyra's heart stopped. "Your Majesty!" "Come with me, please." It wasn't really a request. Lyra nodded mutely, acutely aware of every eye in the room following her as she walked toward where Marcus waited. She could feel Beatrice's fury radiating behind her like heat from a forge, could sense the confusion and speculation rippling through the other servants like wildfire. Marcus stepped aside to let her pass, and as she did, she caught his scent again. Pine and rainfall, and something wild that made her broken wolf stir restlessly. The golden warmth from the night before flickered to life in her chest, and she had to bite her lip to keep from making a sound. They walked in silence through corridors Lyra had only ever seen while scrubbing, their footsteps echoing off stone walls lined with tapestries worth more than she could earn in a lifetime. She was intensely aware of Marcus beside her, of the way he moved with predatory grace despite his size, of the way servants and courtiers alike stepped out of their path with respectful bows. The library was a revelation. Lyra had heard whispers about it, of course, but seeing it was something else entirely. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with more books than she had ever imagined could exist in one place. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating tables scattered with scrolls and manuscripts, creating pools of golden warmth that made the whole space feel magical. "You can read," Marcus said quietly, and it wasn't a question. Lyra nodded, not trusting her voice. She had learned in secret, teaching herself from discarded primers and stolen moments with books left behind by careless nobles. It was dangerous knowledge for someone in her position, but she had never been able to resist the lure of stories and ideas hidden behind written words. "Good." Marcus moved deeper into the library, and she followed hesitantly, afraid to touch anything in this place of wonders. "These texts are older than the castle itself, written in dialects that few scholars remember. I need someone with patience and intelligence to help sort them properly." He stopped beside a table piled high with leather-bound volumes, their covers cracked with age. When he turned to face her, his expression was gentle but serious. "But first we need to talk." Lyra's stomach dropped. Here it was then, the explanation, the reality check, the reminder of her place. "You're wondering why I'm doing this," Marcus continued, settling against the edge of the table with casual grace. "Why I'm involving myself in servant assignments, why I'm here at all." "Yes," she whispered, because lying seemed pointless. "The truth is, I don't entirely know myself." He ran a hand through his dark hair, and she caught a glimpse of vulnerability beneath his confident exterior. "Last night, when I saw you in the throne room, something changed, something I don't fully understand yet." The golden warmth in her chest fluttered like a trapped bird. "Your Majesty." "Marcus," he corrected gently. "I told you to call me Marcus." "Marcus?" His name felt strange and precious on her tongue. "I don't understand what's happening." "Neither do I," he admitted, and something in his honesty made her look up to meet his eyes. "But I know I couldn't stop thinking about you. I know the thought of you being punished for something that wasn't your fault made me want to tear this castle apart stone by stone. And I know that when I woke up this morning, the first thing I wanted was to see you again." Lyra's breath caught. "That's impossible." "Is it?" He moved closer, not crowding her, but close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes. "You felt it too, didn't you, in the throne room, something connecting us?" She had. The golden thread, the warmth, the way her broken wolf had lifted its head and whined with recognition. But admitting that felt too dangerous, too much like hoping for things that could never be. "I'm nobody," she said instead, the familiar refrain falling from her lips like a prayer. "I'm packless, broken. I have nothing to offer someone like you." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to hide. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "Tell me what happened 3 years ago. Tell me why you're here." The request hit her like a physical blow. She had never spoken of it, not to anyone. The shame was too deep, the wound too raw, even after all this time. "I can't," she whispered. "You can." He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement so she could pull away if she wanted. When she didn't, his fingers brushed against her cheek, feather-light against the bruise Beatrice had left there. "Someone hurt you, more than once, and not just physically." The touch was so gentle, so careful, that tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. When was the last time anyone had touched her with kindness? When was the last time anyone had looked at her and seen something worth protecting? "My mate," she began, then stopped, the words sticking in her throat like thorns. "You had a mate." It wasn't a question, and something dark flickered in Marcus's eyes. "I thought I did." The words came out in a rush, years of buried pain spilling over. "Connor, we were bonded young, arranged by our pack elders. I thought he loved me. I thought I was safe." Marcus's hand had gone very still against her cheek, but he didn't speak, didn't push, just waited with infinite patience for her to find the words. "There was a war," she continued, staring at a point over his shoulder, because looking at his face would break what little composure she had left. A border dispute with a rival pack. People were dying, and information was being passed to the enemy. Someone in our pack was feeding them intelligence. And they blamed you, Marcus said quietly. Connor found evidence in our den. Papers, communications, gold that I had never seen before. He brought it to the Pack Alpha, and they had a trial. Connor stood before everyone and rejected our bond, called me a traitor and a whore who had sold out her own people for enemy coin. The memory was as sharp as ever, the taste of Connor's betrayal still bitter on her tongue. She could still see his face, cold and disgusted, as he severed their connection in front of the entire pack. Could still feel the agony of their bond snapping, leaving her broken and alone. "But you didn't do it," Marcus said, and the certainty in his voice made her finally meet his eyes. "No," she whispered. "I didn't, but no one believed me. The evidence was too perfect, too complete. I was banished that same night, cast out with nothing. The real traitor was never found." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes dark with something that might have been fury. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Where is he now, this Connor?" "I don't know. I've tried not to think about it, about any of them. What's the point? They made their choice." "And you've been alone ever since?" It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. 3 years of scraping by, of taking whatever work she could find, of making herself invisible because being noticed meant being hurt. 3 years of believing that maybe Connor had been right, maybe she really was worthless. "Lyra." Marcus's voice was soft, but when she looked up, there was something fierce and protective in his expression that made her heart stutter. "Look at me." She did, drowning in the storm-grey depths of his eyes. "You are not worthless, you are not broken, and you are sure as hell not nobody." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, wiping away a tear she hadn't realised had fallen. "I don't know what game Connor was playing or who really betrayed your pack, but I know it wasn't you." "How can you possibly know that?" "Because," he said simply, "I can smell lies. It's a gift or a curse, depending on how you look at it. And everything you've just told me rings with truth. But more than that—" He paused, something vulnerable flickering in his expression. "More than that, I can feel what you are, here." He placed his free hand over his heart. "You're kind, brave, loyal to a fault. Those aren't the qualities of a traitor." The tears were falling freely now, 3 years of suppressed pain and shame flowing out of her like water from a broken dam. She should pull away, should remember her place, should protect what little was left of her heart. But Marcus's hands were gentle against her face. His voice was warm with conviction, and for the first time in 3 years she felt like maybe she could breathe. "I don't understand why you're being kind to me," she whispered. "Because," he said, leaning closer until she could count the silver flecks in his eyes, "you deserve kindness, you deserve to be protected, and I'll be damned if I let anyone hurt you again." The promise hung between them like a vow, and Lyra felt something inside her chest crack open, letting in light for the first time in years. It was terrifying and wonderful and completely impossible, but as Marcus leaned down and pressed the softest kiss to her forehead, she couldn't bring herself to care about impossible. "Welcome to the library, Lyra Thorne," he murmured against her skin. "I think you're going to like it here." 3 days in the library had been the closest thing to paradise Lyra had ever experienced. The work was fascinating, sorting through ancient texts written in old dialects that challenged her mind in ways she had never imagined possible. Marcus had been right about her patience. She found herself completely absorbed in deciphering faded ink and crumbling pages, losing hours to the puzzle of forgotten languages. But more than that, she loved the quiet sanctuary of it all, the way sunlight streamed through the tall windows and painted everything in gold, The way the musty scent of old leather and parchment made her feel like she was somewhere sacred. The other servants whispered, of course. They always whispered, but their whispers had changed from cruel mockery to confused speculation, and nobody dared to raise a hand to her any more. Word had spread quickly through the castle that the Alpha King himself had personally assigned her to the library, and even Beatrice couldn't argue with a direct royal command. Still, Lyra felt the weight of hostile stares whenever she walked the corridors, heard the muttered questions about what a packless nobody was doing with books that scholars would kill to read. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the warm bubble of safety that Marcus had created around her, but the familiar shame burned in her chest like acid. She was sitting cross-legged on the library floor that afternoon, surrounded by a constellation of manuscripts, when she heard his footsteps in the doorway. Even without looking up, she knew it was him. Her broken wolf stirred beneath her skin, and that golden thread in her chest pulled taut with awareness. "You look like you belong here," Marcus said quietly, and she glanced up to find him leaning against the doorframe, still dressed in his formal council attire, but with his sleeves rolled up and his dark hair slightly mussed. Heat bloomed in her cheeks at the compliment. "I love it," she admitted, gesturing to the organised chaos around her. "These texts, some of them are older than the kingdom itself, the stories they tell, the history preserved here." "I wondered where your mind went when you thought no one was watching," he said, moving into the room with that predatory grace that made her pulse flutter. "Now I know." She started to gather the manuscripts, suddenly self-conscious about taking up so much space, but his hand came to rest gently on her shoulder, stopping her. "Don't," he said softly. "Don't put them away on my account. Show me what you've found." For the next hour she lost herself in sharing her discoveries, explaining the patterns she had identified in the ancient dialect, the connections between texts that had been separated for centuries. Marcus listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that showed he understood not just her words, but the passion behind them. "You have a brilliant mind," he said finally, and the way he was looking at her made something flutter dangerously in her chest. "It's been wasted scrubbing floors." "I'm grateful for the work," she said automatically, because gratitude was safe, gratitude was expected. "But you deserve more than gratitude," Marcus replied, his voice soft but firm. "You deserve to use these gifts, to be valued for your intelligence and insight." Before she could respond, urgent footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. A moment later, Commander Hayes appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Your Majesty," he said with a sharp bow. "Forgive the interruption, but the border situation requires your immediate attention. The Northland delegation has sent new terms that need review before tonight's council session." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I'll be there in a moment, Commander." Hayes bowed again and disappeared, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Marcus turned back to Lyra with an expression that looked almost regretful. "I have to go," he said quietly. "Border disputes don't solve themselves, unfortunately." "Of course," she said, immediately moving to gather the manuscripts again. "I should finish organising these anyway." "Lyra." The way he said her name made her look up, and she found his grey eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Wait for me?" The request was simple, but somehow it felt like so much more, like a promise, like a choice. "Okay," she whispered. His smile was soft and devastating. "Good. I'll try not to be too long." He headed for the door, then paused at the threshold, looking back at her sitting among the scattered manuscripts like some kind of scholarly goddess. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I think you're exactly where you belong." The hours that followed passed slowly. Lyra tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept wandering to the warmth in Marcus's voice, the way he had looked at her like she was something precious. She told herself not to hope, not to read more into his kindness than was really there, but her treacherous heart refused to listen. It was nearly evening when she heard footsteps in the corridor again, multiple sets this time, moving with purpose. She looked up from the text she was translating, expecting to see Marcus returning from his meetings, but instead found herself face to face with headmaid Beatrice and two other senior servants, their expressions ranging from coldly furious to smugly satisfied. "Well, well," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Look what we have here, the little traitor playing scholar in her fancy library." Lyra's stomach dropped, but she kept her voice steady. "Head maid Beatrice, how can I help you?" "Oh, you can help us greatly," Beatrice purred, moving further into the room with the other servants flanking her like predators. "You can explain to us exactly what game you're playing with His Majesty." "I'm not playing any game," Lyra said quietly, rising to her feet but keeping her hands visible, non-threatening. "I'm doing the work I was assigned." "The work you were assigned," laughed Elena, one of Beatrice's cronies. "Listen to her, putting on airs like she belongs here." "You don't belong here," Beatrice snarled, all pretense of sweetness vanishing. "You're packless trash, a proven traitor who somehow wormed her way into the Alpha King's notice, but we see right through you." "I've done nothing wrong," Lyra said, but her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Haven't you?" Beatrice stepped closer, close enough that Lyra could smell the malice rolling off her in waves. "Seducing the Alpha King with your pathetic sob story, making him think you're some innocent victim when we all know what you really are." "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough." Beatrice's smile was razor sharp. "I know you're a lying little whore who betrayed her own pack for gold. I know you're trying to sink your claws into His Majesty because you think royal protection will keep you safe. But you're wrong." Lyra felt the familiar shame rising in her chest, the old voices that told her she was worthless, that she deserved every cruel word and harsh blow. But underneath it, something new stirred, anger, bright and clean and fierce. "I am not," she began. "What you are," Beatrice interrupted, moving even closer, "is a mistake that needs correcting. His Majesty is young, inexperienced with women like you. He doesn't understand how easily a man can be manipulated by a pretty face and a sad story. But we're going to help him see clearly." Elena and the third servant, Marcus, moved to flank Lyra, cutting off her escape routes. The library suddenly felt smaller, the comforting presence of the books unable to protect her from the malice advancing on her from all sides. "We're going to remind you of your place," Beatrice continued, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "We're going to make sure you understand that packless sluts don't get to play princess in this castle. That's enough." The voice that cut through the tension was deadly quiet, carrying a weight of authority that made all four women freeze instantly. Lyra's heart stuttered as she turned toward the doorway, where Marcus stood with an expression of such controlled fury that the air in the room seemed to thicken. Alpha power radiated from him in waves, pressing against everyone present with the unmistakable command to submit. Elena and Marcus, the two servants flanking Lyra, immediately dropped to their knees, heads bowed, instinctively recognizing the dominance of a true alpha in his rage. But Beatrice, stubborn and proud, remained standing. "Your Majesty," she said, with a curtsy that looked more like mockery than respect. "We were just having a conversation with—" "I heard what you were having." Marcus's voice was so cold it could have frozen summer rain. "I heard every word." He stepped into the room, and Lyra noticed the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides, the way the muscle in his jaw jumped with barely contained violence. When his grey eyes fixed on Beatrice, the older woman finally seemed to understand the danger she was in. "Step away from her," Marcus said quietly. "Now." Beatrice took a hasty step back, but her expression remained defiant. "Your Majesty, I was only trying to protect you from—" "From what?" The question cracked like a whip through the air. "From a woman who has shown nothing but kindness and intelligence since arriving here, from someone who works harder and asks for less than anyone in this castle." "She's a traitor!" Beatrice burst out, desperation making her voice shrill. "She betrayed her own pack. She's using you, manipulating—" "She's precious." The words rang through the library like a bell, absolute and uncompromising. Marcus moved closer to Lyra, not quite touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, the protective fury that made his wolf almost visible beneath his skin. "This woman," he continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "is under my personal protection. Anyone who harms her, threatens her, or speaks to her with anything less than respect answers directly to me. Is that understood?" The kneeling servants nodded frantically, but Beatrice's face had gone white with shock and growing fear. "But your Majesty," she stammered, "she's just a—" "She's what?" Marcus's voice dropped to a growl that raised the hair on the back of Lyra's neck. "Tell me, Beatrice. Finish that sentence." Beatrice's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, finally understanding that she had pushed too far, that the protection she had assumed her position provided was nothing compared to the wrath of an alpha defending what was his. "She is a member of this household," Marcus continued when Beatrice remained silent. "She is intelligent, hard-working, and worthy of respect. But more than that." His hand came to rest on Lyra's shoulder, warm and steady and unmistakably possessive. "She matters to me. That should be enough for anyone with sense." Tears pricked at the corners of Lyra's eyes, not from pain this time, but from the overwhelming relief of being defended, of being claimed as something worth protecting. No one had ever stood up for her like this, had ever put themselves between her and the cruelty of others. "Your Majesty," Beatrice tried one last time, her voice small and desperate, "surely you understand that a woman of her background is hardly suitable for—" "For what?" Marcus's patience finally snapped, alpha power flooding the room with such intensity that even Lyra felt the urge to bare her throat in submission. "For my attention, for my protection, for my regard." He turned to face Beatrice fully, and Lyra saw something in his expression that made her breath catch, not just anger, but absolute conviction. "Let me make something very clear to all of you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of royal decree. "Lyra Thorne has more honour in her smallest finger than most people have in their entire bodies. She has survived trials that would break lesser souls, has maintained her kindness and strength despite every attempt to crush them. She is remarkable, she is valued, and she is under my protection." The silence that followed was deafening. Beatrice looked like she had been struck by lightning, her face pale and her eyes wide with the dawning realization that she had just challenged the Alpha King himself over something he clearly cared about deeply. "I trust I've made myself clear?" Marcus asked quietly. "Yes, Your Majesty," Beatrice whispered, finally dropping into a proper curtsy, her defiance crumbling like autumn leaves. "Good." Marcus's voice was still cold, but some of the terrible pressure in the room eased. "You're dismissed, all of you. And Beatrice?" The headmaid looked up hopefully. "If I hear that you've approached Miss Thorne again with anything less than courtesy and respect, you'll find yourself looking for new employment. Am I understood?" "Yes, Your Majesty, completely understood." "Excellent. Now get out." The three servants scrambled to their feet and fled, leaving Lyra and Marcus alone in the sudden quiet of the library. Lyra stood frozen, overwhelmed by what had just happened, by the fierce protection Marcus had shown, by the way he had called her precious in front of witnesses. "Are you all right?" Marcus asked softly, his anger dissolving into concern as he turned to face her. She started to speak, then stopped, emotions too tangled to put into words. "You called me precious." "You are precious," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious truth in the world. "To me, you're precious." The tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over, and she pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed by the intensity of feeling coursing through her. For 3 years she had believed herself worthless, had accepted that she was nobody deserving of nothing. But Marcus looked at her like she hung the moon, defended her like she was something rare and valuable. "Hey," Marcus said gently, his hands coming up to cover hers, slowly drawing them away from her face. "Look at me." She did, drowning in the storm-grey depths of his eyes. "No one," he said fiercely, "will ever speak to you that way again. Not while I'm here to prevent it, I promise you that." "Why?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "Why do you care so much about what happens to me?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his thumbs brushing away the tears on her cheeks with infinite gentleness. "Because," he said finally, "from the moment I saw you in that throne room, something in my world shifted. You matter to me, Lyra. More than I probably should admit, more than is wise or practical or politically sound. But I can't seem to care about any of that when I look at you." "Marcus," she whispered, his name a prayer on her lips. "I know it's complicated," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I know there are 1,000 reasons why this is impossible, but I can't seem to make myself care about impossible when it comes to you." The golden thread between them pulled taut, singing with possibility and promise. Lyra felt herself leaning toward him, drawn by forces she didn't understand but couldn't resist. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Marcus's answer was to lean down and press his lips to hers, soft and searching and full of promise. The kiss was gentle but sure, tasting of hope and possibility and the beginning of something that might just change everything. When they finally broke apart, Marcus rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing hard. "Now," he said quietly, "we figure this out together, if you want to." Lyra thought about all the reasons she should say no, all the ways this could end in heartbreak and disaster. But looking into his eyes, feeling the warmth of his hands against her face, she couldn't bring herself to care about practical concerns. "Yes," she whispered, "I want to." His smile was brilliant and devastating, and full of promises she was finally ready to believe. The chambers Marcus had given her were like stepping into a dream. Lyra stood in the doorway of what was now supposedly her room, overwhelmed by the luxury that surrounded her. Silk curtains in deep blue hung from tall windows that overlooked the castle gardens. A four-poster bed dominated one wall, draped in soft linens that looked like they had never known the touch of rough hands or desperate sleep. A fireplace crackled merrily across from a sitting area furnished with chairs that probably cost more than she had ever owned in her life. It was beautiful, it was impossible, and it terrified her more than Beatrice's threats ever could. "This can't be right," she whispered to the empty air, stepping carefully across thick carpets that felt sinfully soft beneath her worn shoes. He must have made a mistake. But there were her few belongings, the pathetic collection of patched dresses and borrowed shoes that made up everything she owned in the world, laid out carefully on the impossibly elegant bed. Someone had brought them here, had placed them with care in this place of beauty and warmth, as if they belonged. As if she belonged. A soft knock at the door made her jump, her heart hammering against her ribs. She opened it to find a young servant girl with kind eyes and a nervous smile, holding a dinner tray that smelled like heaven. "Miss Thorne," the girl said with a respectful curtsy, "His Majesty asked me to bring you dinner. He said you might be more comfortable eating in your chambers tonight, after what happened in the library." Lyra stared at the tray, laden with foods she had only ever smelled while serving them to others. Roasted meat and fresh bread, vegetables that looked like they had been picked that morning, fruits that gleamed like jewels in the candlelight. "This is too much," she said softly. "His Majesty was very specific about what you should have," the girl replied, moving past Lyra to set the tray on the small table near the fireplace. "He said you've been working hard and deserve a proper meal." Deserve. The word sat strangely in Lyra's chest, foreign and uncomfortable. She had spent 3 years believing she deserved nothing but scraps and suffering. The idea that someone thought she deserved silk curtains and roasted meat felt like trying to wear clothes meant for someone else. "Thank you," she managed, and the servant girl smiled before curtsying again and slipping away. Lyra was picking at the incredible food, trying to convince herself she was allowed to eat it, when another knock came at her door. This time her heart recognized the sound of those footsteps, the particular way Marcus moved through the world with quiet confidence. She opened the door to find him standing there with his own dinner tray, his formal council attire replaced with simple dark clothes that somehow made him look even more devastatingly handsome. "May I come in?" he asked gently. "I thought you might like some company." The question was asked with such careful respect that tears pricked at her eyes. When had anyone ever asked her permission for anything? When had anyone ever cared about what she might want? "Of course," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. Marcus moved to the sitting area, setting his tray across from hers at the small table. "I hope you don't mind," he said, settling into the chair across from her with easy grace. "I thought we could share dinner. I find I don't much like eating alone anymore." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the crackling fire creating an intimate bubble around them. Lyra found herself stealing glances at Marcus, watching the way the firelight played across his strong features, the way his hands moved with careful precision as he cut his meat. Everything about him should have intimidated her, but instead she felt safe, protected, like she could breathe fully for the first time in years. "Tell me about your parents," Marcus said quietly, and the unexpected question made her look up in surprise. "My parents? Before?" he clarified gently. "Before everything went wrong? What were they like?" Lyra was quiet for a long moment, trying to remember faces that had grown blurry with time and pain. "They died when I was young," she said finally. "A hunting accident when I was 15, but before that, they were kind. My mother used to sing while she worked, old songs her grandmother had taught her. My father was a blacksmith, and he would let me help in the forge sometimes, even though the other men said it wasn't proper work for a girl." "They sound wonderful," Marcus said, and something in his voice made her look at him more closely. "What about yours?" she asked softly. His expression darkened, pain flickering across his features like shadows. "Killed in a border raid 7 years ago," he said quietly. "The same war that you were accused of betraying secrets about." Lyra's breath caught. "Marcus, You didn't know," he said quickly, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his. "And it doesn't matter. My parents died fighting to protect this kingdom, and I know they would want me to judge people by their actions, not by the lies others tell about them." His hand was warm and strong over hers, calloused from weapon training but gentle in a way that made her heart ache. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry you lost them." "I'm sorry you lost yours too," he replied, "and I'm sorry for everything that came after. You should have had a pack to protect you when they died, a mate who valued you, a life full of the love and respect you deserve." "Instead, I got Connor," she said with bitter humour. "Tell me about him," Marcus said quietly. "The real Connor, before he betrayed you." Lyra hesitated, old pain rising like bile in her throat. But Marcus's eyes were patient and kind, his thumb stroking gentle circles over her knuckles, and somehow the words came easier than they ever had before. "He was safe," she said finally. "When my parents died, I was alone and frightened, and Connor was there. He was a few years older, already showing signs of being a strong wolf, and he offered stability, protection. I thought that was love." "But it wasn't," Marcus said, "and it wasn't a question." "No," she admitted. "I realise now that it was never love. Not really. It was convenience. I was young and grateful and easy to control, and he liked that. He liked having someone who never questioned him, who was so thankful for his attention that I never asked for more." Marcus's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. "What happened the night he found the evidence? The night he rejected you?" Lyra closed her eyes, the memory as sharp as ever, despite the years between. "He came home late from a pack meeting, claimed he had been with the other males planning patrol routes, but he smelled different, nervous and excited in a way I didn't understand. He said he needed to check something in our den, started going through my things. And he found what he was looking for. He found what someone had planted, she corrected, opening her eyes to meet his steady gaze. Papers I had never seen, communications written in a hand that wasn't mine, gold coins that meant nothing to me. But by then the whole pack had gathered. He called for an emergency meeting and presented the evidence like he was some kind of hero exposing a traitor. Marcus was very still, his grey eyes dark with controlled fury. And nobody questioned it. Nobody thought to ask how convenient it was that he found everything so easily. I tried to defend myself, Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. I begged them to listen, to investigate further, but the evidence was so complete, so damning, and Connor stood there and told them how he had suspected me for weeks, how he had been watching me, how my behaviour had become secretive and suspicious. All lies, she confirmed, but told with such conviction that even I started to doubt myself. When your own mate, the person who is supposed to love you more than anyone in the world, stands before your pack and calls you a traitor. Her voice broke, and Marcus was out of his chair in an instant, kneeling beside her and pulling her into his arms. She went willingly, burying her face against his shoulder and breathing in his scent of pine and rainfall and safety. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his neck. "I'm sorry you have to hear this. Sorry I'm so broken." "You are not broken," Marcus said fiercely, his arms tightening around her. "You are the strongest person I've ever met. To survive what you survived, to maintain your kindness and your integrity despite everything they put you through. Lyra, you're remarkable." She pulled back to look at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt or pity, but found only warmth and absolute conviction. "I lost everything that night," she said softly. "My mate, my pack, my home, my identity. I was cast out with nothing, told never to return on pain of death. I spent months wandering, taking whatever work I could find, sleeping in barns and alleys, and telling myself I was lucky to be alive." "And you were alone all that time," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. "Completely alone. My wolf went silent after Connor severed our bond, and I thought maybe I really was broken, maybe I really was worthless like he said." Marcus's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realised were falling. "Look at me," he said softly. She did, losing herself in the storm-grey depths of his eyes. "Connor was wrong," Marcus said with absolute certainty, "about everything. You are not worthless, you are not broken, you are precious and strong and deserving of every good thing this world has to offer." "How can you be so sure?" she whispered. "Because," he said, leaning closer until their foreheads touched, "I can see you, the real you, not the lies Connor told or the shame others tried to force you to carry. I see your intelligence, your resilience, your capacity for kindness even after everything you've endured. And what I see is extraordinary." The golden warmth in her chest flared to life, stronger than it had ever been, and she felt something that had been broken inside her for 3 long years slowly beginning to heal. "Marcus," she breathed. "I know this is complicated," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know there are protocols and expectations and 1,000 reasons why this is impossible, but I can't seem to make myself care about any of that when I look at you." "What are you saying?" she asked, though part of her already knew, had felt it in the way he looked at her, the way he defended her, the way he said her name like a prayer. "I'm saying that I've been alone on a throne for 7 years, convinced that duty was enough, that I didn't need anything more than the responsibility of protecting this kingdom," Marcus said quietly. "But then I found you in my throne room, and suddenly I understand what I've been missing." Her breath caught. "Marcus?" "I'm saying that I care about you," he continued, his voice gaining strength and certainty. "More than is wise, more than is practical, more than I probably have any right to. I'm saying that when I thought about you being hurt today, about Beatrice and the others trying to break you down, I wanted to tear this castle apart with my bare hands. You barely know me, she whispered, even as her heart sang with hope. I know enough, Marcus said firmly. I know you're brave and kind and intelligent. I know you've survived things that would have destroyed lesser people. I know that when you smile, it feels like the sun coming out after months of winter. And I know that I want to spend whatever time you'll give me learning everything else. Lyra stared at him, overwhelmed by the intensity of his words, by the fierce honesty in his expression. No one had ever spoken to her like this, had ever looked at her like she was something rare and precious. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. I don't know how to be cared about, how to matter to someone. Then we'll figure it out together, Marcus said softly, his hand still gentle against her face. If you want to. No pressure, no expectations. Just us taking this one day at a time. Looking into his eyes, feeling the warmth of his hands against her skin, Lyra felt something shift inside her chest. For 3 years she had believed herself unworthy of love, convinced that Connor's rejection had proven some fundamental flaw in her character. But Marcus looked at her like she was everything good in the world, defended her like she was worth fighting for. Maybe it was time to stop believing Connor's lies and start believing in something better. Yes, she whispered, the word barely audible but ringing with conviction. Yes, I want that. Marcus's smile was brilliant and tender and full of promises she was finally ready to accept. When he leaned down to kiss her, soft and searching and sweet, she kissed him back with all the hope she had been afraid to feel. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For trusting me, he said simply, for giving us a chance, for being brave enough to believe in something good after everything you've been through. Thank you for seeing me, she replied, her voice soft with wonder, for making me feel like I matter. You do matter, Marcus said fiercely. To me, you matter more than you'll ever know. As they settled back in their chairs to finish their dinner, Lyra felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 long years, the warm, golden feeling of belonging somewhere, of being valued by someone who saw all her flaws and chose her anyway. It was terrifying and wonderful and completely impossible. But as Marcus smiled at her across the firelight, she couldn't bring herself to care about impossible. For the first time since Connor had shattered her world, she was ready to hope for something better, and maybe, just maybe, she was ready to believe she deserved it. The morning arrived with fanfare that could be heard throughout the castle. Horns announcing the arrival of the peace delegation, servants scurrying through corridors with linens and silver, the controlled chaos that came with hosting foreign dignitaries. Lyra watched it all from her chamber window, her stomach twisting with a nervousness she couldn't quite name. Marcus had left before dawn for meetings with his council, preparing for the formal negotiations that would begin this afternoon. He had kissed her forehead gently before leaving, promised he would find her later, and Lyra had felt warm and safe in the golden bubble of their new understanding. But now, watching the elaborate preparations below, she felt the familiar weight of not belonging pressing down on her shoulders. What was she doing here? What was a packless servant doing in silk-draped chambers while foreign alphas gathered to discuss the future of kingdoms? A knock at her door interrupted her spiralling thoughts. She opened it expecting to find a servant with breakfast, but instead came face to face with a young page she didn't recognise. "Miss Thorne?" he asked with a nervous bow. "His Majesty requests your presence in the East Gardens. He said to tell you it's urgent." Lyra's heart skipped. Urgent, is something wrong? "I don't know, miss. He just said to bring you right away." She followed the page through corridors she had never seen before, past tapestries depicting great battles and windows that looked out over parts of the castle grounds she could only glimpse from her chambers. They emerged into a secluded garden tucked between the main castle and the guest wings, where morning light filtered through ancient oak trees, Marcus was standing near a stone bench at the garden centre, but he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a man Lyra had hoped never to see again. Connor. Her former mate looked exactly as she remembered, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of conventional good looks that had once made her teenage heart flutter. But now, seeing him next to Marcus, she was struck by how different they were. Where Marcus carried himself with quiet confidence, Connor's posture screamed arrogance. Where Marcus's eyes held warmth and intelligence, Connor's were cold and calculating, and he was staring at her with the same mixture of disgust and contempt that had shattered her world 3 years ago. "Lyra," Marcus said gently, moving toward her with obvious concern. "I'm sorry to bring you here like this, but Connor insisted on speaking with you privately before the formal negotiations begin." "Did he?" Lyra's voice came out steadier than she felt, though her hands trembled as she clasped them behind her back. "How interesting." Connor stepped forward, his lip curling in the familiar sneer that had once made her feel small and worthless. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in." "Connor," she said quietly, lifting her chin despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I bet you didn't," he replied, his voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. Imagine my surprise when I arrived for these peace talks and discovered that the great Alpha King Marcus had taken in a certain packless whore as his pet project. Marcus went very still beside her, and Lyra could feel dangerous energy radiating from him like heat from a forge, but his voice remained carefully controlled when he spoke. "I think you'd better watch your tone, Connor." Connor laughed, a harsh sound that made Lyra's skin crawl. "Oh, I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I forgot you don't know what she really is yet, but don't worry, I'm here to enlighten you." "Marcus," Lyra said quietly, fear clawing at her throat, "maybe I should go." "No," Marcus said firmly, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. "Stay. I want to hear what Connor thinks he has to say." Connor's eyes glittered with malicious delight as he turned his attention back to Lyra. "Still hiding behind powerful men, I see. Some things never change." "Say what you came to say," Marcus commanded, his voice dropping to a growl that raised the hair on Lyra's arms. "Gladly." Connor straightened, suddenly all business. "Your Majesty, I feel it's my duty as a fellow Alpha to warn you about the woman you've brought into your castle. Lyra Thorne is a proven traitor who sold her own pack's secrets to enemy forces during the border wars 3 years ago." "I'm aware of the accusations," Marcus said quietly. "Accusations?" Connor's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "I'm afraid they're rather more than that, Your Majesty. I was her mate at the time. I found the evidence myself, communications with enemy agents, gold payment for information that led to the deaths of dozens of our warriors." Lyra felt the blood drain from her face, the old shame and pain rising like bile in her throat. Even though she knew the truth, even though she knew Connor was lying, hearing the accusations spoken aloud in front of Marcus made her feel sick with panic. "The evidence was quite compelling," Connor continued, his voice gaining strength as he saw Lyra's distress. "So compelling that our Pack Alpha had no choice but to banish her permanently. She was lucky we didn't execute her for treason." "That's enough," Marcus said, but Connor wasn't finished. "But here's what really concerns me, Your Majesty," he said, moving closer with predatory grace. "Lyra has always had a gift for manipulating powerful men. She's beautiful, I'll give her that, and she knows exactly how to play the wounded victim to gain sympathy and protection. I can see she's already worked her magic on you." "You don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, but there was something in his voice, a tiny note of uncertainty that made Lyra's heart crack. "Don't I?" Connor smiled, sensing weakness like blood in the water. "Tell me, Your Majesty, how did you meet her? Let me guess. She was in some sort of distress, looking pathetic and helpless, and your noble instincts kicked in. She probably told you some sob story about being misunderstood, about being falsely accused." Marcus was silent, and in that silence Lyra heard the death of every hope she had dared to nurture. "That's exactly what happened, isn't it?" Connor's voice was triumphant now. "She played the same game with me, Your Majesty, made me believe she was innocent and pure, that she needed my protection. It wasn't until I found the evidence that I realized how thoroughly she had deceived me." "The evidence you planted," Lyra said suddenly, her voice cutting through Connor's monologue like a blade. Connor turned to her with raised eyebrows. "I'm sorry." "The evidence you planted in our den," Lyra repeated, louder this time, anger finally burning through her fear. "The communications you forged, the gold you placed among my belongings. Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out eventually?" "My dear Lyra," Connor said with full sympathy, "I understand that denial is a natural response to being caught, but—" "You are the traitor," Lyra said, her voice gaining strength as pieces finally clicked into place. "You were feeding information to the enemy, and when suspicion started to fall on you, you needed a scapegoat, someone vulnerable and grateful and easy to blame." Connor's expression flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough. Lyra saw the flash of panic in his eyes before his mask of concerned authority slipped back into place. "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Your Majesty," he said, turning back to Marcus with renewed urgency. "She's trying to turn the tables, to make herself the victim by accusing me of her crimes. It's a classic manipulation tactic." Marcus had gone very quiet beside her, his grey eyes unreadable as they moved between Connor and Lyra. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "These are serious accusations, from both sides." Lyra's heart stopped. "Marcus—" "Perhaps," he continued, still in that horrible neutral tone, "it would be best if we discussed this privately. Connor, I assume your delegation needs time to prepare for this afternoon's negotiations?" "Of course, Your Majesty, but I hope you'll consider carefully what I've told you. Lyra is dangerous, and she's using your feelings against you. Don't let her destroy everything you've worked to build." Connor bowed formally and strode away, leaving Lyra alone with Marcus in the suddenly suffocating quiet of the garden. She waited for him to speak, to reassure her, to tell her that nothing Connor had said mattered. Instead, he just stood there, looking at her with those storm-grey eyes that had once been so warm, so full of promise. "You're wondering if it's true," she said quietly, the words cutting like glass in her throat. "I'm wondering why you didn't tell me Connor would be here," Marcus replied, his voice still carefully controlled. "I'm wondering why you didn't mention that he was the one who exposed your alleged crimes." "Because I was afraid," she admitted, tears starting to burn behind her eyes. "I was afraid of exactly this, that hearing his version of events would make you doubt everything I've told you." "And should it?" The question was quiet, but it hit her like a physical blow. "If you have to ask," Lyra said, her voice breaking, "then you don't know me at all." They stared at each other across the space that had suddenly opened between them, and Lyra felt the golden warmth in her chest guttering like a candle in the wind. This was what she had been afraid of from the beginning, that the beautiful dream of being cared for, of being valued, would crumble the moment reality intruded. "I need time to think," Marcus said finally. "I see." Lyra straightened her spine, calling on 3 years of practice in hiding pain behind dignity. "And while you're thinking, what happens to me?" "Nothing happens to you," Marcus said quickly. "You're still under my protection, still welcome in the castle. I need to process this." "Of course you do." Lyra turned to leave, then paused at the garden's edge. "For what it's worth, Marcus, everything I told you last night was true. Every word. But I understand if that's not enough anymore." She walked away before he could respond, her head held high, despite the tears streaming down her face. Behind her, she heard Marcus call her name, but she didn't turn back. There was no point. Connor's poison was already working, already turning the man who had called her precious into someone who looked at her with suspicion and doubt. By the time she reached her chambers, Lyra had made her decision. She couldn't stay here, couldn't watch Marcus slowly pull away as Connor's version of the truth took root in his mind. She had survived being cast out once before. She could do it again. She was halfway through packing her few belongings when her door burst open without warning. Marcus stood in the doorway, his hair dishevelled and his breathing ragged, like he had run through the entire castle to get there. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Leaving," she said simply, not looking up from the worn dress she was folding. "Saving us both the awkwardness of you having to ask me to go." "I never asked you to leave." "You didn't have to." She finally looked at him, and the pain in his grey eyes nearly broke her resolve. "I saw your face in the garden, Marcus. I saw the doubt." "Of course I have doubts," he said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "Connor just accused you of treason, of manipulating me, of being everything I thought you weren't. What did you expect?" "I expected you to know me better than that," Lyra said quietly. "I expected 3 days of seeing who I really am to matter more than 3 minutes of Connor's lies." Marcus ran his hands through his hair, frustration radiating from every line of his body. "It's not that simple, Lyra. I have a responsibility to this kingdom, to these peace negotiations. I can't afford to be wrong about you." "Then you've already made your choice," she said. Turning back to her packing, "You're choosing duty over trust, politics over whatever this was between us. I understand. I just can't stay and watch it happen." "Damn it, Lyra, will you look at me?" She did, and the raw emotion in his expression made her breath catch. "I don't want to doubt you," he said fiercely. "I don't want to believe a word Connor said, but I'm responsible for thousands of lives, and if there's even a chance that you're not who you claim to be—" "Then you need to ask yourself one question," Lyra interrupted, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "In the time you've known me, in the conversations we've shared, in the moments when I thought no one was watching, have I ever given you reason to doubt my character? Not my past, not accusations from others, but me. Who I am when it's just us." Marcus stared at her, something shifting in his expression. "Because if you can honestly say yes," she continued, "then I'll leave right now and never bother you again. But if the answer is no, if every instinct you have tells you that Connor is lying, then you need to decide what matters more, the truth you know in your heart, or the fear of what others might think if you're wrong." The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and heartbreak in equal measure. Lyra held her breath, waiting for his answer, knowing that whatever he said would determine not just her future, but whether the fragile trust they had built could survive its first real test. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Stay." "What?" "Stay," he repeated, moving closer until he could take her hands in his. "Don't leave, please." "Marcus?" "You're right," he said fiercely. "You've never given me reason to doubt you, not once." Connor's words made me panic, made me think about all the ways this could go wrong, but they didn't change what I know about you. "And what do you know about me?" she asked softly. "I know you're kind to servants who have been cruel to you. I know you work harder than anyone else and never complain. I know you cry when you think no one is watching, but you never let it make you bitter. I know you're brilliant and brave and too good for this world." His hands tightened around hers. "And I know that I'd rather be wrong about everything else than be wrong about you." Lyra stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I choose you," Marcus said quietly. "Whatever the consequences, whatever the political implications, whatever Connor or anyone else has to say about it, I choose you. If that makes me a fool, then I'm a fool. But I'm a fool who knows the difference between lies and truth, and everything about you rings true." The words hit her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, warming her from the inside out. She had spent 3 years believing she was unworthy of trust, of love, of anything good. But Marcus looked at her like she was worth choosing, worth believing in, worth fighting for. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said, pulling her into his arms and holding her tight. "I'm sorry I doubted, even for a moment. I'm sorry I let Connor's poison get to me." "You're only human," she said softly, burying her face in his shoulder and breathing in his scent of pine and rainfall and safety. "Well, mostly human." His laugh was rough with relief and love. "Will you stay? Will you give me another chance to prove that I know exactly who you are?" Lyra pulled back to look at him, seeing nothing but warmth and certainty in his storm-grey eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll stay." When he kissed her, soft and desperate and full of promises, she kissed him back with all the hope she had almost lost. Whatever happened next, whatever Connor had planned, they would face it together. And for the first time in her life, that felt like enough. The great hall had never felt larger or more intimidating. Lyra stood beside Marcus at the front of the massive chamber, acutely aware of every eye fixed upon them. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, illuminating banners from a dozen different packs and casting everything in stark, unforgiving light. Delegates filled the benches, their expressions ranging from curious to suspicious to openly hostile. Connor sat with the northern delegation, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. He had spent the last hour spreading poison through whispered conversations, and Lyra could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her like a physical force. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered to Marcus, her voice barely audible above the murmur of conversation filling the hall. Marcus turned to look at her, and the warmth in his storm-grey eyes steadied her racing heart. "I've never been more sure of anything," he said quietly. "Trust me." Before she could respond, he stepped forward, and the hall fell instantly silent. Alpha power radiated from him in waves, commanding attention and respect from every person present. "Lords and ladies of the assembled packs," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the chamber. "We gather today to discuss peace, but first there is a matter of justice that must be addressed." A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. This wasn't what they had expected from a diplomatic summit. 3 years ago, Marcus continued, a young woman was wrongfully accused of treason and banished from her pack based on fabricated evidence. Today, I intend to set that record straight. Connor shot to his feet, his face pale but his voice steady. "Your Majesty, surely this is not the appropriate forum for—" "Sit down," Marcus commanded, and the weight of alpha authority in his voice made Connor drop back into his seat as if his strings had been cut. "You will have your chance to speak, but first you will listen." Marcus moved to stand directly in front of the assembled delegates, and Lyra marvelled at his commanding presence, the way he owned every inch of space around him. Lady Lyra Thorne was accused of passing pack secrets to enemy forces during the border conflicts 3 years ago, he said, his voice ringing with conviction. The evidence against her was compelling, too compelling. Communications written in her hand, gold found among her belongings, testimony from her own mate confirming her guilt. Murmurs rose from the crowd, and Lyra saw several delegates glance at her with expressions of disgust. She lifted her chin, calling on 3 years of practice in bearing shame that wasn't hers to carry. "But I am not the naive young alpha who might once have accepted such evidence at face value," Marcus continued. "I have resources at my disposal, investigators who are very good at uncovering truth from lies, and what they uncovered will shock you." He gestured to Commander Hayes, who stepped forward carrying a leather portfolio thick with documents. "The handwriting on the intercepted communications," Marcus announced as Hayes opened the first document for all to see, was analysed by 3 separate experts. All confirmed that while it resembles Lady Lyra's hand, it was written by someone else, someone who had access to samples of her writing and considerable skill in forgery. A shocked silence fell over the hall. Connor had gone very still in his seat, his face carefully blank. "The gold found among her belongings," Marcus continued, "bore mint marks from the enemy territories, but also showed signs of recent handling. Soil analysis from the coins matched the composition found near the pack's training grounds, nowhere near Lady Lyra's living quarters." "This is ridiculous," Connor burst out, jumping to his feet again. "You can't seriously expect us to believe—" "I expect you to hear the truth," Marcus said coldly. "All of it." Hayes moved to the next document, and Lyra's breath caught as she recognised bank records, communication intercepts, witness statements. "The real traitor," Marcus announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, was someone with access to pack security protocols, someone who could move freely through restricted areas, someone who needed a convenient scapegoat when suspicion began to fall in his direction. He turned to look directly at Connor, and his smile was sharp as a blade. Someone like Beta Connor Thorne, who had been secretly corresponding with enemy agents for months before his mate was accused. Someone who had gambling debts that required immediate payment. Someone who planted evidence in his own den and then discovered it with perfect timing. The hall erupted in shocked voices, delegates turning to stare at Connor with expressions of horror and disgust. Connor's face had gone white as bone, his carefully constructed mask finally slipping to reveal the panic underneath. "You have no proof," he snarled, but his voice cracked on the words. "Don't I?" Marcus nodded to Hayes, who produced another set of documents. Bank records showing payments to your account from enemy agents, intercepted communications in your actual handwriting, testimony from 3 different witnesses who saw you in locations you claimed never to have visited. Connor looked around the hall desperately, seeking support from his delegation, but found only horrified stares and disgusted expressions. The truth was written clearly on every face. He had been caught, completely and thoroughly exposed. "And finally," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet that somehow carried more weight than any shout, "we have this." Hayes produced a final document, and even from where she stood, Lyra could see Connor's face go grey with recognition. "A confession," Marcus announced, "written in Connor's own hand and sealed with his personal mark. Found among his belongings when my investigators searched his quarters this morning. A detailed account of how he betrayed his own pack, how he planted evidence to frame his innocent mate, how he destroyed a young woman's life to cover his own crimes." The silence that followed was deafening. Lyra felt tears streaming down her face, not from sadness this time, but from overwhelming relief. 3 years of carrying shame that wasn't hers. 3 years of believing she might be the monster Connor had painted her as, and now everyone could see the truth. "Connor Thorne," Marcus continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority, "you are guilty of treason against your own pack, of conspiracy with enemy forces, and of perjury in the false accusation of an innocent woman. But more than that, you are guilty of destroying the life of someone who trusted you, who loved you, who deserved your protection instead of your betrayal." Connor was on his feet now, his face twisted with desperate rage. "She was nobody," he shouted, his carefully constructed facade finally crumbling completely. A packless orphan with no family, no connections, no value to anyone. She was the perfect scapegoat. The words hung in the air like a curse, and Lyra watched as the assembled delegates recoiled from Connor's naked cruelty. Even his own pack members were staring at him with horror and disgust. "She was your mate," one of the northern elders said quietly, her voice heavy with revulsion. "She trusted you to protect her, and you used that trust to destroy her." "She was nothing," Connor spat, his composure completely gone now. "Less than nothing, and she would have remained nothing if this fool hadn't decided to play hero." Marcus moved so quickly that Connor didn't have time to react. One moment he was standing among his delegation, the next he was pressed against the wall with Marcus's hand at his throat, alpha power flooding the room with such intensity that every person present felt the urge to submit. "Her name," Marcus said quietly, his voice deadly calm despite the fury radiating from him, "is Lady Lyra Thorne, and she is worth more than you will ever be." He released Connor, who collapsed to his knees gasping for air, then turned to address the hall once more. Lady Lyra has endured 3 years of exile for crimes she did not commit, Marcus announced, his voice carrying absolute conviction. 3 years of believing herself worthless because the person who was supposed to love her chose to destroy her instead, but she survived. More than that, she maintained her integrity, her kindness, her strength despite everything that was done to her. He moved to stand beside Lyra, taking her hand in his with gentle reverence. I have seen her work tirelessly without complaint. I have seen her show compassion to those who have been cruel to her. I have seen her intelligence, her resilience, her capacity for forgiveness even in the face of unforgivable wrongs. And I have seen her heart, pure and brave and beautiful. Marcus turned to face her then, and the love in his eyes made her breath catch in her throat. "Lyra Thorne," he said, his voice soft but carrying clearly through the silent hall. "You have been alone too long. You have carried burdens that were never yours to bear. You have believed lies about your worth that should never have been spoken." He dropped to one knee before her, still holding her hand, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. "I claim you as my mate," he said clearly, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. "I claim you as my Luna, my queen, my equal in all things. Not because I pity you, not because I'm trying to right the wrongs done to you, but because you are extraordinary, because you are precious, because I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone." Lyra stared down at him, overwhelmed by the intensity of his declaration, by the public nature of his claim, by the way he was looking at her like she hung the stars in the sky. "Marcus," she whispered, acutely aware of every eye in the hall upon them. "Will you have me?" he asked softly. "Will you be my mate, my partner, my queen? Will you help me rule this kingdom with the wisdom and compassion I see in you every day?" The tears were flowing freely now, 3 years of pain and shame washing away in the face of his absolute faith in her worth. She thought about the scared girl who had scrubbed floors and believed herself nobody, and marvelled at how far she had come. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, I will." Marcus's smile was brilliant as he rose to his feet, still holding her hand. "Then, by the power vested in me as Alpha King of these lands, I claim Lady Lyra Thorne as my mate and queen." The mating bond that had been growing between them suddenly blazed to full life, golden and warm and unbreakable. Lyra gasped at the intensity of it, at the way it completed something inside her that she hadn't even realized was broken. "My Luna," Marcus said softly, raising their joined hands to his lips to press a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "My Alpha," she replied, the words feeling right and true and perfect. The hall erupted in cheers and applause, the assembled delegates rising to their feet to honour their new queen. But Lyra only had eyes for Marcus, for the man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, who had chosen to believe in her when the world told him he was a fool. Later, after the formal ceremonies and the feast and the endless congratulations, they found themselves alone in the garden where it had all almost fallen apart. The moon was full overhead, painting everything in silver light, and Lyra marvelled at how different this place felt now. Not a scene of heartbreak, but of triumph. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly, settling beside Marcus on the stone bench where they had first kissed. "Claiming me so publicly, making it impossible to take back?" "Never," Marcus said fiercely, pulling her closer until she was curled against his side. "The only thing I regret is that it took me so long to realize what you were to me." "And what am I to you?" she asked, even though she knew the answer now, could feel it in the golden warmth of their bond. "Everything," he said simply. "My mate, my queen, my heart, the missing piece I didn't know I was looking for." Lyra smiled, pressing her face into the curve of his neck and breathing in his scent of pine and rainfall and home. "I love you too," she whispered against his skin. "Good," Marcus said, his arms tightening around her, "because you're stuck with me now. Royal mate bonds are notoriously difficult to break." "Is that a threat or a promise?" she asked, laughing softly. "Both," he replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Definitely both." 6 months later, as Lyra held court beside Marcus and helped him make decisions that affected thousands of lives, she sometimes thought about the scared girl who had once scrubbed floors in borrowed dresses. That girl had believed herself nobody, had accepted cruelty as her due, had never dared to hope for anything better. But that girl had been wrong about almost everything. She wasn't nobody, she was a queen. She wasn't worthless, she was precious beyond measure. And she wasn't alone. She had found her home, her family, her purpose in the arms of a man who saw her true worth even when she couldn't see it herself. It had taken 3 years of darkness to find the light, but now that she had it, Lyra knew she would never let it go. And judging by the way Marcus looked at her during every council meeting, every public appearance, every quiet moment when it was just the two of them, she knew he felt exactly the same way. They had both been alone too long, had both carried burdens too heavy for any one person to bear. But together they were exactly what the other needed. A perfect match, a completed bond, a love story that had begun in the shadows and bloomed into something beautiful enough to light up the world. Where are you listening from tonight? I hope these stories of second chances and finding home resonate with you wherever you are in your own journey. Sometimes the people who hurt us try to convince us we're not worthy of love, but the truth is always more beautiful than the lies they tell. If you'd like to support me and help more people discover these tales of hope and healing, please subscribe. It's free and means everything to this storyteller's heart.